How is it that society has not learned from history about the dangers of socialism, Marxism, ideology, etc. after years? How do Marxists get away with it? Well, let's not go with the dangers of ideology. Let's go with the dangers of, like to call it, radical left-wing ideology. Well, I think the reason for this, and this also might be the reason that there's a strange thing that the iconography of communism is still acceptable socially, whereas the iconography of Nazism isn't. Now, I'm not saying that we should make the icons of Nazism socially acceptable either. I think that the communist icons shouldn't be socially acceptable, but they are. And there's probably a reason for that, you know. Now, part of it is that the left has never taken on, the radical left has never taken responsibility for being on the same side as the Stalinists and the Maoists and the Cambodian murderers and all of that. So that's part of it. But then the next part is I think there's something deeper. I think that, you know, inequality is a reality. And it's a reality that cannot be put at the feet of capitalism or at the feet of human political structure. There's a good book, you guys might want to read this, called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. And it's a new book, and it's a study of inequality. And one of the things he does is do an empirical analysis of the relationship between inequality, the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, and the ideological position of governments. So here's the theory. The hypothesis would be, well, because the left-wingers are concerned with inequality, if you measured inequality in under left-wing governments and you measured inequality under right-wing governments, you'd expect a reduction in inequality under left-wing governments. And the results are no difference. And so what does that mean? It doesn't mean that left-wings are hypocrites, although it might mean that because people can be hypocrites. But what it means is the problem of inequality is so intractable that we don't know of any appropriate political, sociological, or economic solutions that actually work. It's a real catastrophe. Now, inequality in itself might not be a bad thing unless it's too extreme. It's extreme when people say start to starve, and then clearly something's, you know, it's very difficult to. I think everyone would agree that that's a suboptimal outcome. You know, we don't need to get all ideological about that. But some degree of inequality is useful because, well, it gives people something to strive for. It gives them an up, right? It means, I was thinking about this, sometimes you actually want people to be rich because if a new product is introduced into the market, there have to be people around who have substantial pools of capital to be able to afford it when it's still novel. And then that market brings the price down for everyone else. And so if everyone had exactly the same income, it would be very difficult to introduce expensive products into the market with the hope that their price would plummet. That actually is a big deal. You want large pools of capital sitting around too so that people can invest in very, very complex things. And you also want large pools of capital to be in the hands of private individuals so that there's forces that are powerful that are competitive with the government and with other large organizations. So anyways, though, back to the Marxists. Despite the fact that there are reasons for inequality, and despite the fact that you can't lay the fact of inequality at the feet of capitalism, and despite the fact that capitalism also appears to be making everyone not absolutely poor at the same time as it makes some people very rich, inequality is still painful reality, and no one really likes it. You know, I mean, you can lord it over someone, I suppose, and extract out some sense of your moral superiority because you happen to occupy a hierarchical position that's higher, and sometimes there's some validity in that, especially if you've earned it. Although I would say, like, glorying in it is probably a suboptimal outcome. It's still the case that inequality violates a moral intuition that everyone has, I think, and that's probably the moral intuitions that lie along the agreeable axis. It's like, well, wouldn't it be better if everyone had enough? It's like, well, who argues with that? You know, I mean, everyone feels that way. And so I think a thoughtless compassion makes Marxism naively attractive. And I'm not being cynical about that, because there is some utility in naive agreeableness. But unfortunately, the world is a very complicated place. And merely wanting to be nice about things and wishing that everything was fair doesn't justify imposing an equity outcome and gerrymandering complex economic systems that will bite you if you mess with them because you're ideologically possessed. I am 46, retired executive, wealthy, competent, and full of juice. Who can I talk to if I want to invest time/money/energy in your university? Lots of people are asking me such things, and it's very much appreciated. It's weird, because you'd think that if people are offering you time and money, that it would be a straightforward thing to say, yes, please climb aboard and help. But it's not that simple, because first of all, I don't want to involve people in something that I can't be sufficiently committed to. It's not fair to them. And it isn't obvious to me how I can be committed to this yet, fully committed to it. And so I'm sort of playing with it at the level that I can manage. It's not like it's a game. We have a good product involved, or a good product in motion at the moment. But I don't have the wherewithal to scale at the moment. And, you can say, and people who are developing new businesses like to do this, like let's say I could come up with a draft business plan for an online university, and then I could contact people like you, Paul, and say, look, I'm ready to gather investments, and let's say I could raise $20 million, or let's say I could raise $200 million. Then I have a new problem. The problem is, well, oh my God, I've got all this money, now I have to figure out something to do with it. And that's actually a really big responsibility. It's not like, it's a success catastrophe, let's say. It's a first world problem. I get all that. But that doesn't mean that it isn't real. So I have to do a lot more thinking and planning and figure out how to disperse my time most effectively before I dare to take on any additional people who would like to help. Now, once my organization is in a place where that sort of help would be useful, then I'll make a public announcement. And I would be more than happy for people to jump on board, let's say, climb on board, start pushing, devote resources, all of those things. I'd be happy for that to happen then. But I don't want to do it prematurely, because I don't want people to risk their valuable resources in an endeavor that isn't yet solid. So, all right, so I'm only going to do, I think, one more question. I am a sober alcoholic/drug addict. How can I find my way back to belief in a higher power after 10 years in the empty void of atheism? I'm falling apart. Well, I would say your best bet is to actually start devoting some time to it. For me, I became convinced of the validity of a religious viewpoint, I think, as a consequence of study. Read Joseph Campbell. Read Carl Jung. Jung's hard. Campbell's a good introduction, though. Mircea Eliade as well. I don't know if you can find your way back to belief, but you might be able to find your way back to meaningful engagement, and that's a better way of thinking about it. The belief thing is a really tricky one. People ask me, do you believe in God? And I really think, how dare you ask that question? I think that's really what I think. But on a more prosaic level, I usually think, well, I don't know what you mean by belief. I don't know what you mean by belief. And I don't know what you mean by God. These are very difficult questions, and none of that's self-evident. Now, I would say, do I believe in the crucifixion? Well, certainly. I mean, people, the crucifixion, how can you not believe in it? If you think symbolically, it's like human beings we're eternally crucified, right? Our lives are tragic and they end in death, and we're all betrayed. We're all betrayed. We all experience betrayal. So you can't not believe in the crucifixion. Do you believe in the resurrection? Well, people die and are reborn all the time. You know, they go through, this is what you're after here. I'm a sober alcohol drug addict. Well, you know, you had to let a lot of you die when you stopped being an addict and something new be reborn. It's like, well, what's the ultimate significance of that? And how is it tied to the notion of bodily resurrection? Well, I don't know what the ultimate significance is, but it does seem to be the pathway through life. To believe, I would say you start believing not by attempting to convince yourself that the statement, there is a God, is true, like a fact is true, but to act out the proposition that you should shoulder your cross and stumble uphill towards the city of God. That's belief, man. And you can do that right away. Now, you might ask, well, do I have any guarantee that that has transcendent and universal significance? It's like, well, it's not a bad model for emulation, so it has universal significance in that regard. We each have to shoulder the tragedy of our existence and stumble upwards despite that. That has universal significance. Does it have significance outside of life? In like at the eternal realm? It wouldn't surprise me if it did. I suppose it depends on what you mean by the eternal realm. It seems to have significance in the eternal realm of consciousness. It seems to have significance in the eternal realm of unconscious fantasy, implicit fantasy, and mythology. How is it connected with the factual world? That's a hard question because the factual world, in some sense, divorced itself from that transcendental world during the development of the scientific methodology. So, never the twain shall meet. It's a methodological issue in part. I think you probably have to draw on the same forces that enabled you to sober up and abandon your drug addiction. You know, something was guiding you forward. Go forward again. Go forward again as if there is a higher power. That's your manifestation of faith. My kids are mixed. I resent the disempowering narrative of victimhood being handed to them. It's lazy and offensive. How to arm them against it? That's a good one. Well, the first question is, you didn't tell me how old they were, so that complicates things. But I would say you better pay attention to what they're being taught in school. My suggestion to parents is that if your kids are in a class where they talk about diversity, equity, inclusivity, gender, white privilege, that's not a bad, there's other words too, but we'll stick with those, that your kids should be encouraged to leave the class because they're not being educated, they're being indoctrinated. Now that doesn't mean that there can't be an intelligent discussion about any one of those topics, but when they come together in a group, then that's a pretty good marker that you're in the vicinity of a radical leftist, neo-Marxist ideology, and there's no excuse for that being foisted on your children. You may have to have a serious chat with your school, with your kids' teachers, with the principal. You may have to learn how to formulate your arguments against the practice. Like, if you resent it, what are you going to do? You're going to put up with it? You're going to get angry and take it out on someone else? You're going to do something stupid because you're resentful? It's like that's likely, right? Or you're going to swallow it and get weak. I mean, Jesus, those are dismal options. mean, first of all, you might want to find out if all your resentment is justified. You can talk to someone that you admire and see if you're just flying off the handle, because maybe you are. But if you're not, well, if something is happening that you really don't like, that's a sign that you have to do something about it, because your being is rebelling against that constraint. So you have to get more educated. You have to get more articulate. You have to get more politically oriented, politically savvy, politically involved. You have to talk to people and make a coalition. You have to face down your children's teacher. You have to come up with a plan for what happens if, when you face them down, nothing changes. You have to lay out a strategy of ideational war, or you have to live with your resentment and risk having your children disempowered by the narrative of victimhood. That seems like a really bad outcome. You know, if they see you resisting it actively, then you are right then and there acting out the contrary narrative. So if you don't believe that they should be described as disempowered, then you should act in a manner that indicates that your convictions have far more potency than you might believe. Sam Harris has accused me of sophistry in my Bible lectures. How do you draw the line between sophistry and a valid reading? Well, welcome to the universe of literary criticism. Seriously, right? Because that's the real question. I look for patterns. You know, when I wrote Maps of Meaning, which is my first book, I laid out a description of the way that we perceive the world, and I wanted to know if it was an accurate perception. And so I tested it against multiple levels of analysis, and so I wanted to see, well, did it stand up? Did the story stand up logically? Was it in keeping with what was known at that point in terms of functional neuropsychology? Was it in keeping with the literary tradition? Did it make sense from the perspective of mythology? All of these things. And my supposition was that if the interpretation remained coherent across all those levels of analysis, the probability that that was spurious was very low. Just like you can think about it as akin to the way that you detect whether or not something's real using your senses. You have 5 qualitatively different senses. And if one of them reports the existence of something, that might be faulty. And if 2 report the existence of something, maybe even that would be faulty. But if 5 of them report it, then the probability that there's something there is starting to become high enough so that you don't die by relying on it, which is really our fundamental, what would you say it, manifestation, indication of sufficiency. You know, I don't think Sam really accused me of sophistry precisely. What he did was say, like the postmodernists say, any text is susceptible to a very large number of interpretations. How do you know yours is, well, you could say true? This is where things get complicated, because it depends on what you mean by true, which is another thing that Sam and I had a head-to-head about. You know, I act out my interpretations of the stories that I read, and I detect the consequence of that action in the world and use that as another means of determining their validity. So acting in this manner, the manner that I believe is appropriate as a consequence of the way that I've come to interpret these great mythological stories, has been of inestimable benefit in my life. And I think it's helped my family a lot, my immediate family and my broader family. It's helped my friends. It's helped my students. It seems to be helping the broader community. And it's commensurate with what I know scientifically. And so if that's sophistry, that isn't sophistry, because it's just too many points of contact. So no. Besides, there's other ways of protecting yourself against sophistry too. One of the ways you can tell if you're a social scientist and you've actually found something is that you're not happy about it. So if you do a data analysis and you get a result and you think, oh God, that's the last thing I hoped for, then that's pretty good evidence, not conclusive obviously, that's pretty good evidence that you've actually found something real. That's sort of like the data that's been generated by the personality theorists lately, showing that as societies become more egalitarian, the proclivity of men and women to choose different occupational routes increases rather than decreases. You can be sure that whoever made that finding, that isn't what they were hoping for. Because well, first of all, who would hope for that? It's just, there isn't an ideology supporting that as a desirable outcome. I mean, it might be a great outcome because it means that as you make societies more sociologically flat, say, in terms of opportunity, men and women get to choose what they want, and they actually choose different things, and that's okay. You could say that, but hardly anyone is. So there's almost no one who's happy when they find that. So often when you interpret a story, let's say you come up with a self-serving interpretation, then you might think, well, I'm not going to trust that because it's self-serving. But often I believe if you take the Jungian tack, for example, through the mythological material, you don't find what you want. You find the opposite of that. Jung said, what's his prime dictum derived from alchemy? Instir quilinis invenatur, which I'm probably butchering in terms of pronunciation. Of course, no one knows because it's Latin. What you most want will be found where you least want to look. Well, that's hardly a self-serving interpretation. Who's going to generate that, man? But that's the dragon and the gold right there. So, if your interpretation makes things more difficult for you, makes things more challenging, requires you to be more mature, requires you to be more responsible, all of those things, then I would also say that that's a testament to its validity, because it's not self-evidently contaminated by impulsive self-interest.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. I've been wanting to ask you this for a while now, since I started watching your lectures. After I started reading Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, I came upon a paragraph in his chapter on scholars that really bothered me, and it actually bothers me to this day. He talked about this kind of person like they were just a mirror. Like they stretched, he said, every part of their skin basically to allow every new piece of information that they took on, and that all they ever were was just an instrument. They were just a mirror and reflecting what they had learned, never actually having generated anything on their own. And it's bothered me because I feel like in a way it sort of like it's impacted my identity a lot, because I don't know, how are you supposed to create something, so.
Okay, well that's okay. That's a really good question. I mean, Nietzsche is often classed with the existentialists, right? And so one of the tenets of existentialism, there's two real tenets of existentialism. There's more, but obviously we're oversimplifying. But one is that life is a problem. It isn't because there's something wrong with you. It's that life is a problem. And so that's often contrasted with the Freudian view, which is that if you have a problem, it's because something went wrong during your development. The existentialist said, no, it's like life is a problem, make no mistake about it. And that the purpose of scholarship is in some sense to solve that problem. And so for Nietzsche, like he said, all truths are bloody truths to me. And what he meant by that was that if an idea didn't incarnate itself in you and transform your perceptions and your actions, then you were merely possessed by the idea. You were merely a spokesperson for the idea. Or you could say that the idea possessed you. You're a puppet for the idea. It's not you. It's the idea is in you and it has you. You haven't taken the idea and incorporated it with you and made it part of your life. And so there's a romanticism that's associated with that, right? That's the passionate scholar, the person for whom ideas are not merely, they're not merely what would you call abstracted representations that can be tossed about as if they're commodities. They're more like personalities. That might be another way of thinking about it. And so, if those ideas are compelling, then you don't. Like one thing I learned a long time ago, and I think this is probably relevant. I know when I was a kid, I liked to argue, and I liked to win arguments or lose them, although I liked winning them a lot better. But I didn't really mind so much what the content of the argument was. You know, I could engage in it like a sparring match, and it was in some sense to establish dominance, right? To establish intellectual dominance. I quit doing that when I was in my mid-20s because I thought that was too shallow an approach to the ideas. They're not commodities of that sort. They have tendrils that reach down into the living. That's the right way to think about it. And so Nietzsche's criticism of scholars, and he did this a lot, was that they were bloodless. You know, they were full of performative contradictions. That's another way of thinking about it. They'd say one thing and do another because their intellect was completely dissociated from their actions. And he thought that was a very bad idea. And I think that that's a good criticism. I think it is a bad idea. I also think it makes for an extraordinarily boring lecturer. You know, because you can tell if you're listening to someone whether the ideas that you're hearing are merely being passed through the person as if they're being memorized, say, or whether they're part of the dynamic core of the person. And if they're part of the dynamic core of the person, then they're almost always engaging and gripping. And so he wasn't a fan of bloodless scholars. And I think that's correct because one of the things that I see, it's not a good idea to have ideas possess you. Unless you know what the ideas are up to. And lots of people are possessed by ideas rather than possessing them. And what that means is they haven't taken the ideas and integrated them into their own being. They haven't, it's like an incarnation in a sense. They haven't incarnated the ideas in embodied form. And so they're incomplete. You know, Nietzsche also, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, when Zarathustra comes down the mountain, he sees a bunch of people gathered around a famous individual. I think maybe a scholar, but it doesn't really matter. And when Zarathustra goes and looks at the person, all he sees is a little tiny midget with a gigantic ear. And so he's a hyper specialist, right? And so he has a pretty impressive ear, but he's only this big. And that was Nietzsche's imagistic commentary on the danger of hyperspecialization, and also on the danger of adulation for hyperspecialization. And because he thought about it as a kind of deformity. Now, Nietzsche was a pretty harsh guy, but he did address the issue of the relationship between intellectual knowledge and action, because for Nietzsche, those things are not to be separated in some sense. So, yeah, so maybe, I don't know why maybe it bothered you. Like, it's hard to say why it bothered you. It might have bothered you because it sort of undermined the idea of scholar. But the other possibility, and this isn't an accusation because obviously I don't know anything about you, but it might also be that it struck a chord, you know, and that maybe you were doubtful or questioning how tightly associated your intellectual endeavor was with your actual character and your practice. Representations of God the Father. I like these representations. I like the triangle idea. I mean, I don't know why God is wearing a triangular hat. It's kind of a strange fashion choice, but I think it's associated with the idea of the pyramid, and I think that's associated with the idea of the hierarchy of authority. And I think that's why the Egyptians put their pharaohs inside pyramids. I know there's more to it than that, but I think some of that has to do with the notion of this hierarchical structure. You see this on the... Now, that's speculative, obviously, and I don't want to make too much of it, but I can't help but think that there's something to that. See, that's on the back of the American dollar bill. I like that a lot. That's like the Eye of Horus from the Egyptians. And so the idea here is something like, at the top of the hierarchy is something that is no longer part of the hierarchy. Right? So if you move up the hierarchy enough, what happens is that you develop the ability, as a consequence of moving up that hierarchy, to be detached enough from the hierarchy so you're no longer really part of it, and so that you can move in all sorts of different hierarchies. And the idea here is that the thing that you're really developing is the capacity to pay attention. And I would say, from a
mythological perspective, the one thing that seems to compete with the idea of the spoken word as the source of the extraction of habitable order from chaos is the eye, is the capacity to pay attention. So Marduk, for example, the Mesopotamian creator god, who emerged in the hierarchy of Mesopotamian gods and came out at the top, right? He was the victor of the gods. He had eyes all the way around his head, and he could speak magic words. And I really like that. I really like that idea. And the Egyptians developed that idea too, because their god Horus was the eye. Everyone knows the eye of Horus. That image is so compelling that we still know about it. Everybody has seen the eye of Horus with a really open pupil. And what the Egyptians learned was that the open eye was what revivified the dead society. It's so smart. So what do you do if your life isn't in order? Bloody well pay attention. And that isn't the same as thinking. It's a different process. Paying attention, thinking is like the imposition of structure in some sense. I know I'm oversimplifying, but paying attention is something like watching for what you don't know. And so, like, one of the things I often recommend to my clinical clients if they're having trouble with a family member is, number one, shut up. Don't tell them anything about yourself. And I don't mean in a rude way. It's just like, no more personal information. Number two, watch them like a hawk and listen. And if you do that long enough, they will tell you exactly what they're up to. And they will also tell you who they think you are. And then you'll be shocked because they think you're something, generally speaking, that's not like what you are at all. And when they tell you, it's like a revelation to both of you. But attention is an unbelievably powerful force. And you see this in psychotherapy too, because a lot of what you do, and in any reparative relationship, is really pay attention to the other person. Pay attention and listen. And you would not believe what people will tell you or reveal to you if you watch them as if you want to know, instead of watching them so that you'll have your prejudices reinforced. That's usually how people interact. It's like, I want to keep thinking about you the way I'm thinking about you, and so I'm going to filter out anything that disproves my theory. That's not what I'm talking about at all. It's like, I'm going to watch you and figure out what you're up to. Not in a rude way, none of that. I just want to see what's there. And that'll be good for you, probably, and also be good for me. And so, well, so that's the idea that, climbing up a hierarchy of authority can give you vision, and that vision can transcend the actual hierarchy. And I think that's also that's the metaphysical space that an artist occupies. Because artists really aren't in a hierarchy. They're outside of hierarchies. You've watched The Lion King, most of you? Yeah. That's Zazu, the little bird that's the eye of the king. That's the same thing there. So, and that's echoed in this idea as well. So well, that's some more ideas of hierarchies, same idea. This is, right, gold, silver, bronze. Why gold? Gold is the sun. Gold is pure, right? And so the idea is that the thing that's at the top of the hierarchy is incorruptible, because gold doesn't mix with anything else, right? It's the sort of metal that doesn't ever become corrupted. It's a noble metal. It doesn't become corrupted. And so it shines like the sun, and it's associated with what's ever at the top of the hierarchy. And the gold medal is a disc, like the sun, and it's awarded to those people who've occupied the top position and who are manifestations of the ideal. And here's I'll tell you a quick story. So imagine that you're watching an Olympic contest. I found this happens to me very often with gymnastics, because the gymnasts are so absolutely unbelievable, So you watch a gymnastic performance, and the person's out there bouncing around like, you can't even imagine doing it. They're so perfect at it. So you see this person, they're going through this routine. They're just absolutely spectacular and flawless at it. At the end, they stop and everybody claps, and they're all excited to see what a human being can do. And that's why we're in the audience watching, because we want to see what a human being can do. And the judges go like 9.8, 9.8, 9.8, and everybody's thrilled. And then the next contestant comes out, and it's like, well, they're just basically screwed, right? It's like, this person came out there and was perfect. How are you going to top that? That's an interesting question, because this is a representation of what you do to top perfection itself. And you can do it. And here's how you do it. And you know this, even though you don't know, you know it. So let's say the next contestant comes out, and they're kind of shaky because it's like, oh man, the bar's being raised high. So what they do is they put themselves right on the edge of chaos. And you can tell by watching them that they are one bloody fraction of a second from catastrophe. They're pushing themselves farther than they've ever gone in the direction of their perfection. And everyone in the room is so tense they can hardly stand it, right? You can hear a pin drop, and that person is flipping around, and it's just right on the edge of catastrophe. And at the end, they go like this, you know. And there's that gesture of triumph that goes along with that. And everybody rises in one instant and just claps like mad. It's like, well, why? What are you doing? What are you doing when you're doing that? Right? You can't even help it. It grabs you right in the core of your being. And you stand up, and it's an act of worship. That's what it is. And you saw someone go beyond their perfection into the domain of chaos and establish order right in front of your eyes. And you're so thrilled about that. You know, you're happy to be alive, and everyone's celebrating it all at the same time. And it's an absolutely amazing thing. And that's what, well, sometimes that's what this represents, and sometimes that's what this represents. And that's what we're trying to get at, because that's at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, right? Not only are you doing what you should be doing, but you're doing it in a way that increases the probability that you'll do it better the next time you do it. And then you could say, here's another thing to think about along the same lines. And I know we haven't got to Adam and Eve yet. You tell your kids to play fair, right? You say, it's not whether or not you win, it's how you play the game. And you say that and you don't really know what you mean. You feel kind of stupid saying it even though you know it's true. And your kid looks at you like there's something wrong with you because he doesn't know what you're talking about either. But you know it's true. And so here's why it's true. Life isn't a game. It's a set of games. And the rule is, never sacrifice victory across the set of games for victory in one game. Right? And that's what it means to play properly. You want to play so that people keep inviting you to play, because that's how you win, right? You win by being invited to play the largest possible array of games. And the way you do that is by manifesting the fact that you can play in a reciprocal manner every time you play, even if there's victory at stake. And that's what makes you successful across time. And we all know that, and we even tell our kids that, but we don't know that we know it. And so we're not adapting ourselves to the game and victory in the game. We're adapting ourselves to the meta game and victory across the set of all possible games. And that's what that's exactly what, as far as I can tell, that's exactly what this is aiming at too. That's the same idea, that there's a mode of being that transcends the particularities of the localized contest. That's the other way to think about it. And to act morally is not to win today's contest at the expense of the rest of possible contests. And again, I don't see that as something that's arbitrary. It's not relativistic. There's an absolute moral stance there, and everyone recognizes it. And I also think it's the key to success. And I would also say it's very much akin in a strange way. Like the person who is the master at being invited to play the largest possible number of games is also the same person. I haven't quite figured out the precise relationship between these two. Is also the same person that goes out forthrightly to conquer the unknown before it presents itself as the enemy at the door. They're the same thing. Now I haven't figured out why that is exactly, but well, I'll figure it out eventually, and when I do, I'll tell you. Well, if you're interested. So, okay, so here's some other ideas of God as hierarchical authority figure. So strip the religious preconceptions off what you observe and just look at what you see. Well, look, there's primate looking upward at dominant figure. That's what you see there. Now, it's very interestingly symbolically represented because you have God the Father there with the cross. And I think what that means, as far as I can tell, is that there's a recognition there in the image that the person who's most dominant is the one has the most authority, is the one who's voluntarily accepted the suffering that's part of being. And that's what that picture represents. It's like the authority holds that and says, this is what you have to accept. And that transfixes the viewer because of the fact that it's true. And you think, well, is that true? Okay, well, think about it this way. Do you like brave people or do you like cowards? Well, that's pretty straightforward. And what's the ultimate act of bravery? It's to come to terms with the fact that you're mortal and limited and to live forthrightly regardless. Well, obviously, that's at the core of what's admirable. And why would we presume that that's not the case? We act as if that's the case. It's what everyone dreams and wishes that they could do. I mean, assuming that you've dispensed with the idea that you're going to be immortal. I suppose that might be worth wishing for too, or perhaps not. Immortal is a very long time. But you certainly want this, and that image says, well, this is what you should be. And we've got that same opening into the sky going on in that image that I showed you before. It's like this is a transcendent truth that constantly remanifests itself across time and space. And Jung would say, it's built into your psyche, that image. Now, there are elements of it that are culturally constructed. It wouldn't necessarily have to be the cross, although the cross is a very old symbol. It's far older than its use in Christianity, and it's been used in many, many religious representations. But that echoes, the soul echoes with that. And then there's Moses up there on the mount receiving the law. And so we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to Exodus. But if we get to Exodus. So, well, look, where does it happen? Well, on a mountain. Well, that's a pyramid. That's up, right? That's up. It's up. It's up in the stratosphere. It's up in the sky where you look upward. Okay, and then so what's happening to Moses? Well, here's a bit of a clue, as far as I can tell. I figured this out partly again by reading Jean Piaget, because one of the things that Piaget said about kids was that they first learn to play a game, but they don't know what the rules are. Meaning that if you have a bunch of kids together, they can play a game. But if you take one of the kids out of the game when they're young, say 6, and you say what are the rules, they can only sort of give you a representation. So you take 6-year-old 1 and he'll tell you some of the rules, and 6-year-old 2 will tell you different rules, and 6-year-old 3 will tell you different rules. But if you put them all together, they can play. So they have the knowledge embodied either individually or in the group. The knowledge is there to be extracted. Well, then they get a little older, they can extract the rules. And then they start to play by the rules. And then Piaget's last step was, well, it isn't just that kids play by the rules, it's that they learn that they can make the rules. And he thought about that as moral progression. First you can play, then you can play by the rules. Then you learn, maybe, because he didn't think everyone learned this, that you're actually the master of the rules. That doesn't mean the rules are arbitrary, but it means that you can be the generator of the rules.